Paul in 1 Corinthians 12 talks about differences of administration, but the same Lord. So that's our aim here today, is to look at different kinds of administration, but how the Lord can work with that. I remember when I was a very young man, somebody said that an organization is no better than the people that are in it. So if you have good leaders who are kind and they communicate well and they value the gifts that God puts in the body, you can have a variety of administrative systems that work well if that's the kinds of things that characterize the leaders. If the leaders are cold and they distrust the body and they don't communicate well, then no system is going to work. So we're just going to talk about a variety of systems here this afternoon, and we're going to start here with Brother Larry. He's going to talk about what an unaffiliated congregation looks like, one type of unaffiliated congregations. And then Alan Roth is going to talk about what a loosely affiliated congregation looks like with the Biblical Mennonite Alliance. And then Jeremy Sensing is going to talk about a more strongly affiliated type of church group, such as the Keystone Mennonite Fellowship. We do not have any very strong affiliated ones where everything goes to the top, but not a lot of people here are in a situation like that. So at this time, we're just going to let each of them talk a bit about where they come from and what their church operates like.
I grew up in the Liberal Mennonite Conference of Franconia Mennonite Conference. The church I grew up in about 3 or 4 years ago merged with a Southern Baptist church. I guess I should ask Jonathan how that works. But a number of years ago, maybe 10 now, I'm just saying I don't have the background that a lot of people do in conservative Anabaptism, but I was with a bunch of other families, Anabaptist families, and at the end of the week, we were together for a week, and at the end of the week, one brother came to me from a more high church, and he said to me, I'm glad I got to know you. He said, the unaffiliated used to be a bad word to me, and I find that sometimes that's around more than it's not as much maybe as it used to be, but unaffiliated, I don't know what it means to you. Sometimes we ask people, what group are you with? And they say Keystone. We kind of have this box that we can put them in. When people say, we're beachy, kind of the box. Unaffiliated, they don't know where to put us, because their government is a lot more to different ones. And so I was telling Randy Miller, maybe I'll have to have him talk on some too, because I'm sure we do some things different. Also, this past February, I was with a group, and we were talking about the differences, and a beachy bishop came to me and said, Larry, what does unaffiliated mean, or how do they function? I said, well, they're kind of like beachy. In that our churches, most of the decisions are made local, and we do, as leaders, interact with other leaders, and we then take that back to our church. We might get counsel, but there's no outside person that would come in actually and say, this is how things are done, or we don't have somebody else's statement of faith and practice, although we do sometimes interact with those and adopt some of those things from other churches, but there's no strong accountability, though we look at it as accountability with all other conservative Anabaptist churches. I'm always wondering where to stop here, because other churches, it feels like sometimes they are accountable within their group, but don't feel any accountability. It feels to us as unaffiliated that they don't feel any accountability to anybody outside their group. Whereas as unaffiliated, we kind of feel accountability to the other. But the decisions are made mostly local church, and I'll explain more of that as we go along here.
So in my experience, growing up in Oregon, my home church had withdrawn in the 60s from Pacific Coast Conference because of the drift that they saw. And so I grew up in a church where conference was a bad word, kind of like synonym with Sodom and Gomorrah and Babylon. Come out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord God, and I will touch not the unclean thing. So in my early 20s, I went to Rosedale Bible Institute, and that was part of Conservative Conference. And I discovered, well, you know, there are Christians out there in conferences, and some of them are really nice. And some of them are nicer even than those that are in unaffiliated churches. So that broadened my horizons. And then in Central America, I participated in helping to establish a conference there that was a daughter conference of Conservative Conference. Coming back to the States, then I discovered how far conference had moved during those years, and it was troublesome to me. Coming out of that, then the Biblical Mennonite Alliance was formed, and our church joined that. So in our association of churches, which is nearing 80 churches, there's a document that lays out the parameters around the family farm. This is what you must embrace in belief and practice, at least at a minimum. And then each local church develops their own church covenant and may not subtract from that document, but they may add some additional restrictions or requirements as they choose. Then all of the churches are subdivided into, we call them regions, not to exceed 7 congregations. And in those regions, we meet together quarterly as pastors to encourage each other. Every 5 years, one of the pastors in that region is chosen to be an overseer, and he is to be a counselor or an advisor, a pastor to the pastors. And so at the local congregational level, the baptisms are done there, the marrying, the burying, the ordaining, and so on. But then if there are larger issues, doctrinal issues, that needs to be referred up to that coalition of pastors called overseers. The alliance itself grants the credentials for ordinations. And if there's inter-congregational conflict, then the overseer comes in to help work through that. But he does not come to say who can be baptized or married or buried or take communion and so on. So essentially it is a congregational autonomy, but with certain limits, the boundaries around the farm, you might say, as to who qualifies and who doesn't to be a member of the alliance.
All right, well, after some of what they shared, I have the unenviable task of representing a conference. I grew up on the mission field, but as members of a church in Keystone, and so what is now known as Keystone, I remember the days when Keystone, the group of Keystone churches separated off of Lancaster Conference, so we've always, in a sense, been a part of that type of church governance, that type of system. Just another FYI, a couple of them. I am not a church planter, and I also personally am probably less of a conference individual at heart and more of a brotherhood fellowship type individual. But I am where God has placed me, and I'm grateful to Him for that. But I was sharing, it was kind of funny. A co-worker of mine, we were riding back from a meeting in Pittsburgh on Monday, and I was telling him about the forum coming up, and he said, "Let me get this straight. You're a fellowship-minded, brotherhood-minded individual sharing at a church planters forum representing a conference, and you're a non-church planter." I said, he said, "What's wrong with this picture?" I said, "I think they were desperate." And you know, it may be problematic for me to be here. I have several disadvantages over my brothers here, a lack of gray hair, although I'm catching up to you slowly. So my experience is obviously less than theirs, time-wise. But, you know, some of those disadvantages may be a strength as well. You Alan has the advantage of having been intimately involved in the formation of their fellowship. I watched as a teenager while Keystone was being formed. But I see, as we think about types of governance, we're throwing around terms rather loosely. Fellowship, conference. There's really a continuum of criteria that cause us to determine where a church governance is actually at. And when you think about Keystone, well, Keystone isn't actually, it's called Keystone Mennonite Fellowship. So we have a fellowship here, and I'm representing a conference. Well, explain that picture here? Well, the reality is, from my perspective, and there's Aaron, you're sitting back there. You can. I did run this by Kevin Groff just to make sure I wasn't going to get in trouble. But the reality is, we are fellowship in name, but we tend to operate in governance a little bit more like a conference, more toward the conference end of the spectrum. We'll get into some of that later on and some of the specific questions. I really over-prepared. I saw 15 to 20 minutes on an email, and so I'm ready to give you a mini sermon, I guess. But as I think about the reality of us as whether we're a fellowship, we're unaffiliated, whether we're a conference, each one can work. What is the make or break in those is our ability to assess our own weaknesses, really. To assess ourselves honestly, critically, in light of God's Word. And I've found for us as Anabaptists, we tend to be much more skilled at assessing the failures of the evangelical world than assessing the failures of my own world. And that's, if I can interject a burden for you as church planters, I am not one, but if we're refusing to deal with the dysfunction of our own world and inviting a watching world to join, what are we inviting them to? I think it's crucial we learn to assess and deal with our own dysfunctions before we try and evangelize, or just as strongly as we're trying to evangelize a watching world, because they're going to sniff out the dysfunction that's there. I would, part of a, I can get my books in line. Sorry about that. I had the privilege of being part of a small business group, and almost cringe admitting that, I am involved in business and some other ventures. Really enjoy it, and I know you're not supposed to say that here at your Church Planters Forum, but one of the books we've gone through is Leadership and Self-Deception, and if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it for you. Leadership and Self-Deception. It's by the Arbinger Institute. And it really deals with a fundamental issue. The subtitle is Getting Out of the Box. Fundamental issue of how I tend to view myself and others.
Okay, and what was the author for that book again?
So it's the Arbinger Institute. It's not an individual's name, but yeah.
All right, thank you for that introduction. So now we're just going to go into some specific questions, and each one of these brothers will answer that however they'd like to. So the first question is, in your church, or if you're part of a bigger group, you can explain further what decisions are made at the local level and which decisions are made at a different level. So who decides and how are basic decisions made? Go ahead, Larry.
Well, obviously we make decisions locally. I have a basic, and this won't work in all situations, but a basic motto that the ministry decide after hearing from the congregation, keeping in touch. We are a small congregation, so we know pretty much what's going on and what's needed to be talked about. And so we decide what the issues are that we need to talk about now, or decisions that need to be made. And then as a men's group, we decide what the options are. As a congregation, we decide which option is the one that we would like to take as a congregation. So kind of those three areas there.
So it's somewhat similar in our church. We don't have men's meetings, but we do have members' meetings. So the leadership team will look over and decide which things they need to decide, and then they'll make a decision about things to bring to the congregation. So when it comes to internal church affairs, those things are taken care of at the local church. If there are larger doctrinal issues, or when it comes to the selection of leaders in the church, then we ask the pastor, who's the overseer of our region, to help walk with us through that. That's basically describes it.
So very similar, actually. Basic decisions would be decided our church, our congregation particularly. And now not all Keystone churches are the same, so we do have some variation. But our congregation would have an annual business meeting. Any issues that are brought up there would be decided by the ministry team and work through, I guess, in advance. We all try to get on the same page with that, and yes, we do have disagreements at times, and probably always will, I guess, and as long as I'm a part of it anyway. But no, it's healthy. That disagreement is crucial. Healthy disagreement is so imperative in any organization, any church leadership team, but making sure it stays healthy and doesn't become dysfunctional and toxic. So larger policy decisions, and then we would use the term bishop. The bishop committee larger policy decisions. For example, we recently shifted away from one method of dealing with abuse and abuse reporting and handling. We shifted approaches on that to more of a committee, a CCI committee approach. That decision really was, they got feedback from ministry teams, but then they made the decision as a bishop committee, from what I understand. I wasn't there, but and so even that little comment, I wasn't there, that's what I understand. That gives you a little bit of a picture of how our fellowship. I got a new term from Norm today, from a friend of his. We were talking, and he said his friend told him it's a conferring fellowship. I guess that's what Keystone is. We're a conferring fellowship, kind of a hybrid between the conference and fellowship.
Okay. Next question. What about church covenants or statements of faith and practice, whatever term you use? How do you decide the values and practices of the local church, and how are changes made to the church covenant?
As a church, yes, we have a statement of faith and practice. We don't have a regular time to revisit that. We did recently, we spent the last year on our Bible study nights, Wednesday nights, looking at each one, spending a couple nights on one, or a night, sometimes just a night on one, looking at the scriptures we have in that, and just studying the scripture and saying, is this relevant today? Are there other scriptures that should be added to this, or some that don't make sense, or is the wording archaic that needs to be changed? And it was really interesting because we have a number of youth coming up. Well, sometimes I say a number, about 5 or 6, some of them getting married here or just got married. And so it was good for them, I think, to look at it and say, well, what do you see in these scriptures? And it gave them a lot more buy-in in looking at that.
So we have not made a change to our church covenant at this point. Maybe it needs to be reviewed again. But the broader fellowship has major points of faith and practice, and then each local church tweaks that to fit their own setting there. But no, we have not yet made changes to our church covenant.
We do have a church covenant as well. I don't have the history to know exactly how that was initially set up. When the congregation I'm part of would have started about 9 years ago off of a sister congregation. So in a sense, I got there a year after they started. It was an old Lancaster Conference church that had kind of died out. So it is, I guess, in a sense, a church plant. But yeah, we would review those. We are building a plan and working on a plan, just going through portions of that, working our way through the church covenant, just to kind of keep it in front of people, and so that we know what we've agreed to, and yeah, what we're shooting for.
One thing I might add, across the BMA, every 5 years, constitutionally, it's set up that we go through, all of the churches go through what we call an assessment of unity. And so there are like a dozen or so questions, and people can affirm either I disagree, number one, I mostly agree and will support, number two, or three, I wholeheartedly agree and support. And so what that does then, and then it's filled out by every member across the alliance. And then the overseer of that region receives a copy of that, and that gives him sort of an internal look at what's going on within each congregation. And if there are too many ones, I don't agree, then there's going to have to be some discussion with that congregation and with the leadership team. Are you as a leadership team going to work so that those ones become twos at least, and that more twos will become threes? Or are you no longer going to fit within the alliance? And there have been on occasions where entire congregations have decided, you know what, we've changed enough that we don't fit anymore, and we are going to disaffiliate and move on.
Do you have a comment?
I was going to ask him
Okay.
about that. I knew the BMA did that, and I sometimes think it would be good to have a regular time. And I'm still contemplating kind of mimicking that, of looking at it every 5 years or whatever and saying, are you still there?
Okay, so be jotting notes down. We're going to have a time for you to ask questions here at the end. So we're going to keep moving along just to give you this overview, but then we want to hear from you once we're finished here with the prepared questions. So we'll start with Jeremy this time. How does your church go about choosing leaders?
The ministry team would voice it. I guess they would work through it internally and discuss the need. And once they reach a point of agreement on that, the bishop committee would give them a go-ahead. That would get approved by the bishop committee. They would then come back to the congregation and announce it, or actually not announce it, but in a sense sometimes I think maybe the congregations feel that way. So I didn't really get into our weaknesses yet. Maybe there will be a chance or whatever, but Keystone, we have our weaknesses. I'm not going to defend us, but they would go to the congregation for approval or support. Can you support this? And then if the congregation was in agreement, they would move ahead with the ordination. The other part of that, I'm not sure, we would use a lot as well. If there was only one name, obviously no lot, but.
So at the congregational level, if it's discerned that additional leadership is needed, then the leaders of that group will get in touch with the overseer in the region, and he and perhaps another brother will come and help the congregation to walk through that process, to take the voice of the congregation to discern, are they going to use a lot or are they going to use vote? And once that leader or those leaders are chosen, nominated, there is a questionnaire that they go through to see if there's compatibility between this person and the congregation and the BMA. And if there is, then that person is either licensed or ordained and then presented for membership within the ministerial body of the BMA.
What is the difference there between being licensed or ordained? How does your group view that?
So licensure is, excuse me, licensure is to perform pastoral functions for a specific term. It could be 1 year, it could be 2 years, and it may be renewable. And in our setting, it can be renewed for 2-year periods twice, I think. And then they either need to proceed toward ordination or step down. The only thing that a licensed pastor cannot do that an ordained pastor does is to ordain other pastors. Whereas an ordained pastor, then it's open-ended, it's indefinite, and doesn't need to be revisited.
So none of that goes back to the general BMA alliance. It's just the overseer would be giving input there, but that's the extent of input that the congregation would get.
The overseer helps to see over the process, to moderate it. And then once the person is selected, if it's licensure, it's just reported back to the body. And if it is an ordination, then he is presented to the pastors as a candidate member of the alliance, and then it's voted on whether for him to be received or not be received.
We haven't had since I'm lead pastor now, we haven't had a ordination, but basically how we choose, when the ministry decides, and we are talking about that, and the deacon, and when we are feeling the need for another ordination, then we would put it out to the men's group, to the congregation ultimately, of do you agree to go ahead? When that decision would be made, then we would, usually the local, like lead pastor, would have a qualification message on one Sunday. The following Sunday, we would have another pastor come in. Usually either we're in the eastern part of, we're east of Lancaster County bit, and so we usually either we work a lot with the Keystone and with Mid-Atlantic, as well as we have Beachy and other unaffiliated ministers coming, but usually Keystone or Mid-Atlantic, another minister coming in and having a qualification message, and then we take nominations that Sunday after that, and with that other person there as well, and we require 3 nominations for a person to be considered. At least their name is given at least 3 times. We, in the last, I think it's 7 ordinations, we have had one time that we used the lot. All the others were by the voice of the congregation. There was one person that was given that was just obvious, this is the person that the Lord chose, and so it's voice of the congregation, but if there are 2, then we use the lot for the parting of the mighty.
Okay, thank you. Question number 4, back to you, Larry. How do you decide who to bring into membership?
When someone wants to join, if it's a person who is transferring from another congregation, we ask for a letter, if possible, to come. If not, by confession of faith. If it's a person who's not been baptized, or instructed, even if we had one couple come to us from a Reformed Baptist, I believe, and began to develop convictions and wanted to come in. And so we also had them go through instruction class so that they would understand our doctrine and where we are, and they appreciated that and joined. We would, after instruction or our sitting with them and talking with them, we would usually recommend them to the congregation, and then the congregation would take a vote. Usually the vote is just by standing in the congregation. If we know that there might be, if we hear some people talking that have questions or something, then we have already had each family come down and give their vote individually to be able to voice any concerns that they might have that we could take care of working through that.
I'm not on the leadership team in our church now, but for 20-some years I was. And so it's very similar to what Larry laid out there.
So the process be some similarities. We would, if we had individuals expressing interest, either a new believer or someone who is wanting to transfer membership, and we discuss it as a ministry team. Is there evidence of salvation, knowing Christ, and evidence in their walk? And if we are seeing a way clear to move ahead there, we will, if it's a new believer, we then have them go in. We have instruction class, and if they are transferring, we will receive members into membership with just a transfer letter. If there is not a transfer letter, and some of the backstory is unclear, and yet they're professing, yes, I believe in Christ, I made a commitment, we will sometimes have older individuals, married couples, go through the instruction class, the new believers class as well. And then we will let the congregation know when the new believers class is going, and if there's anybody else that wants to join, they also have time there to give feedback if there's any concerns. And if not, then we'd move ahead with either baptism and or bring them into membership.
All right, question number 5, back to Jeremy. How does your church handle church discipline? You can talk about it from the local level as well as the bishop committee or whatever.
This is one that I'm probably less experienced on. So it's been 3 years ago that I was ordained, and we have had people leave. We've had issues that we've had to talk to people over. We have never actually had to excommunicate anybody in those 3 years. But in the event that it would happen, it would be a fairly well documented and not just a quick. Our Keystone would not be quick, in my experience, quick to either put someone on proving or quick to excommunicate. But we would talk with them, work with them, and in the event that they were saying, look, I'm just not willing to work with you all, there would eventually be an excommunication. But I would say Keystone's probably very cautious on that, maybe to a fault. You could say maybe weak on the discipline side of correction.
So the two kinds of church discipline with Keystone would be putting somebody on proving, which means you're going to be set back from communion for a while maybe, or something like that, and excommunication. Those two are the basic disciplines that they would use.
Yeah, I would say so. And again, they're not used frequently.
So in the course of my giving leadership to our church, there were 2 times we had to excommunicate. It was very painful, difficult. So as leaders, we tried working with the person. It was with the persons. It was issues of immorality. And once we were able to get clear that it was a real case of that, and the person was not workable, we went to the members then with a recommendation from us as a leadership team to the membership that they be excommunicated, rather than just as leaders. We didn't want to say, well, we excommunicate you. It has to be a church decision. And then there have been cases where people changed in their lifestyle applications that no longer reflected what they had agreed to and what we had agreed to as a congregation. And we talked with them and tried to call their attention to that. And then in one case, I had to ask this guy, so which is it? Are you going to keep your ear studs and your corn braids, or are you going to keep your membership? And it was not an easy thing. In one case, the person just laughed in our faces while we were praying for him. It's painful. But he himself chose to remove himself, so we didn't need to have an excommunication. But I do feel very strongly that it should be, if there is an excommunication, it should be by action of the church and not just by the leaders, because you need the support of the church in ongoing interactions with that person. Otherwise, you have the leaders saying one thing and some of the members saying another thing. Now, in the case of leaders who have fallen, it could be doctrinally or it could be morally. In the Alliance, there has been one very sad case where a leader had his credentials had to be revoked because he had a secret life, a double life that was going on. It was very painful. So in that case, the overseer in his region worked with other leaders of that church to confront that leader. He acknowledged it, and then it was brought to the pastors for his credentials to be revoked. So those are very sad cases, and I hope you never have to go through them. But I do remember a quote by a Puritan church leader a long time ago. He said, and I don't remember his name, but this is the quote: "When church discipline goes out the door, Christ goes with it."
In that line, one of the things about an unaffiliated congregation, the congregation holds the credentials. I think you said both of your groups, the group holds the credentials of the church. So if in our model, in our ideal model, if a pastor wanted to leave and go to another church, or a church wanted to pick that up, we would, and ask for his credentials, we would take a vote as a congregation and then do that. But if a pastor is in error, there's not an easy way in our model of unaffiliated to really deal with that, other than the other minister or deacon almost working with the rest of the congregation to rise up. And so that's one of the weaknesses of the unaffiliated. What happens with a rogue pastor? It's difficult for us to deal with it, whereas the other groups would have a better plan. As far as members, we've had, our goal, of course, is reconciliation. We've talked to people. Most of, as the others said as well, have left. However, we had two that we did need to excommunicate. One we did reinstate after a couple years, came back in and was reconciled to the church, and that was a blessing. But as Brother Allen said, it's painful going through the time of where seeing lack of repentance and needing to get to the point of excommunication. We don't really do proving that I can remember. Sometimes people have voluntarily said, things aren't quite right, I'll stay back from communion. I don't feel like I can take communion this time, and we honor that and try and walk with them. But it seems like things have always been processed by the next communion.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now I'll let you do some summaries. I think we'll take all three questions at the end together. So what would you say are the strengths of your administrative model? What are the challenges or perhaps even weaknesses? And if you could tweak yours within your system, if you could tweak it, what were some tweaks you would make? So maybe Larry, you can start.
One of the strengths is that we can make decisions for the congregation that's specific for us. and not try and fit a model that might be good at another place. But that's also a weakness of not having that place specifically to go to. A lot of groups, they get together as a council, they have their overseer, they have their bishop committee, they have some place to go for counsel. We're working at, and we just had our first meeting, now we're starting a network of Anabaptist, unaffiliated Anabaptist churches. It's a network looking at staying unaffiliated, but more having, if I can, and sorry if you're Beachy and you disagree with this, but it's how I see you, Beachy, kind of where the ministry can get together with other churches. The last time we met, it was 3 of our churches. There are others who have expressed interest since. We plan to meet twice a year in this network and looking at a place where we can kind of do this without having to start another fellowship or conference. I think there's plenty of that out there. And so we are excited about that and looking forward to that opportunity to network together. It'll be even weaker than the BMA as far as alliance, but kind of to make up for some of those weaknesses that we feel of counsel, of interaction. Some of our churches are out there like us. We have to go to we have to drive an hour to the next unaffiliated church. And it's just where we're located. Some of you say, wow, an hour, that would be nice. But we're feeling the need for that. And so we're kind of doing a local chapter. It's a certain geographical area that our goal is. One of the important parts of our church as unaffiliated is the plural ministry. We have in our statement of faith and practice that we have a bishop, a minister, and a deacon. And we, about 7 years ago, the pastor left, and so it was just the bishop and deacon. And so I really feel a lack in that. And we've looked at it, and we haven't felt to go ahead with that yet. I am probably pushing harder than anyone else for it because I'm 61. And I have a 10-year plan, and some things need to happen before too long, and it looks like God is providing. And so we're so grateful for that. As far as, there's one thing I didn't mention about how Lansdale Mennonite Church was started. It was started by a conference church, wanted to reach into the town. And in 1970, 2 bishops in the conference said to the other bishops, we see the way some things are going, we'd like to be considered the conservative churches of the Franconia Conference. Franconia Mennonite Conference is the oldest Mennonite conference in the United States. And the other bishops excused those 2 bishops and then brought them back in after discussion, and they said, we're going to give you the 2 meeting houses, we recommend you go and do your own thing, and whoever wants to move to one church or the other is how it is. So that's kind of how it was. We came there in 1982 and was pastor in 85. And so that's just kind of where we are. We haven't changed. We looked at affiliating, and because of recognizing some of the importance, some people say that an unaffiliated church doesn't last long historically. And one of the disadvantages we find is we're a small congregation. We are hoping to find more people and to help out with the work. That's been difficult. It's difficult for a person with a mentality of should be part of a fellowship or a conference to come to an unaffiliated church. Also, there's not as much feeling of responsibility to go and help out another church because they're not part of us. And so that's some of the disadvantages that we find as we walk together. Also, when you meet somebody and you say, I'm unaffiliated, I often wonder what they're thinking because they know this unaffiliated church that's over there and they know that unaffiliated church that looks way different. And so it's not as defined when you're meeting somebody. Maybe I'll think of more later, but I'll stop for now.
If you keep talking, Larry, you might end up in BMA. You didn't hear that, so that's okay. You were laughing at something else. Strengths? Well, there's the strength of having a certain common understanding of what we believe in practice. Yeah, because before a church or a pastor becomes a part of BMA, they have to agree to that. And so it has sort of a sifting process. Another real strength of our association is it is not top-down bishop directed, and I'm not saying that Keystone is like that. There are groups that are that way. But there's a lot of freedom and flexibility at the local level. And so that gives us the ability to adapt to different parts of the country and hopefully around the world. Another good advantage of our model is that we have regular times of getting together. Every January is the pastors and deacons meeting and wives, and then every summer we have a public meeting, people getting together. And that provides a structure, you could say some rails along which the train cars go for regular meetings, for missions, for the Bible Institute, for other committees and ministries, as well as regular times to interact with each other and to build relationships and to discover the gifts that are out there in the body for making use at the local congregational level. So those are some of the strengths of our model. Challenges or weaknesses could be sort of like what Larry said. Some people might know one BMA church and not like it at all. And so then they paint all of us with the same brush. So since we are not tightly managing each congregation and their church covenant and so on, there can be a significant diversity. And some people like that, and some people don't like that. And some aspects of the diversity I don't like either. And it worries me. But then others have grace with me and some of my diversity and have been patient with me, and I like that. So another model is that when there is intercongregational conflict, we have a place to go. And it's already in place. We don't have to decide, it's there. So that can be helpful as well. The Council of Overseers, that is the one that's chosen in each of the regions, meets regularly to help oversee the whole movement and what are the challenges across the movement that we need to be working at, looking at and working with. So those are some of the things, and I like it so much that I've continued with it. So I'll stop the promotional pitch right there.
So, Alan used a term in there that's in my notes, and it's okay if we are top down. I mean, but that term top down, what really does that mean? You know, I hear that thrown around a lot, and you know, there has been a shift. There's a growing number of unaffiliated churches today, and I believe that could possibly be due to some of the abuses and overreaches of the conferences. But really, what does top-down mean? When you think about authority and scriptural authority, as the Bible teaches it, there is a sense of top-down chain of command. Everybody recognizes it, except the church. Yeah, you read books from guys like Jocko Willink in the Navy, they clearly get it. The main problem with authority then, as I see it in our Anabaptist circles, in whether it's conferences or not, you know, that's really not a question, because just like Keystone, I'm here representing Keystone, that's just technically a fellowship, but I'm here representing them as a conference to you. Well, the same thing can happen with an unaffiliated or a loosely run fellowship. They can be an unaffiliated in name, but still be operating in the same mentality. And it all comes back to the thing of power and leadership. And are those, as was mentioned earlier, how are the people that are leading actually leading? You know, an unaffiliated in the hands of a narcissistic controlling megalomaniac with a nice spiritual facade is a cult. Just like a conference is, if they're in those hands as well. And both can be there. I would say, I'm not here to assess their weaknesses, but it's a little easier for an unaffiliated to be pulled into those situations, and there's lots of them out there. It's a whole lot harder to pull a conference out of that situation if they're in the hands of some of those people, and that's happened as well. And so neither is foolproof. Really, it comes back to the character and the understanding of actually using the authority that is vested on us as leadership. Are we using it for my own protection, my own benefit, or are we using that as Christ did in serving and using it, sacrificing myself? If I have to choose between making a decision that is a decision of integrity or protecting my own skin, what am I going to choose? What are you going to choose? And it doesn't matter. You're going to get in that situation whether you're unaffiliated or whether you're in a conference. You're going to be faced with that as a leader sometime. And if you choose, the moment you choose to start self-protecting, to make those decisions out of self-protection, is the moment that power has begun corrupting you. That old saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, is actually untrue, because it's the misuse of that power. It's when I begin using that power in a way that's so un-Christ-like, I begin using it to preserve the organization, to preserve me as a leader. That's when that power begins corrupting, and that's when so many are destroyed, and it's happening today by men who their hearts may be right, may be sincere, but we've developed cultures where you make the decision for the benefit of the organization or the church, and it costs. And at that moment, if I as a leader begin, or an individual within an organization, begin using my power, the voice I have, and make decisions to self-protect, I begin to die, and I destroy a lot of other people in that. So really, that's some of what we're wrestling here in church governance. The weaknesses of the strengths of Keystone. Let's start with the strengths. Stability. But someone has said that our greatest strength usually gives us a clue to our greatest weakness as well. Stability out of balance becomes a liability, right? Stability can be a really good thing, but if you're trying to adapt to a new culture or adapt to unbelievers, stability and rigidity, you might want to reterm it. Maybe it's not stability anymore, and maybe it's rigidity or legalism can become the liability. So that our strengths, for all of us, really, our strengths are also our weaknesses. Another strength would be the larger group of leaders brings strengths, but then again, each of us are dysfunctional to some degree, one degree or another. It's not whether we're dysfunctional or not, just the question is how dysfunctional are we? The bigger the pool of leaders that we draw from, the bigger the conglomerate of dysfunction as well. So you have the balancing factor of more leaders in a conference, but then you also have the baggage that comes with it. So the strength, again, is also your weakness. Support in times of struggle can be huge. And I ran this by a friend who is actually executive director at Heralds of Hope where I work. Tony High was just ordained into BMA. Don't tell him that. But he was saying, I'm just going to read his quote. I put this up on our Microsoft Teams and just asked for his input. This is what he said. There are times that an organization such as a conference could prevent mission and church planting failures. You know what? Conference isn't exactly an evil thing, and I would say Acts probably, the examples we have in Scripture would probably lean more toward conference operation than toward congregational, but you can challenge me on that. But I'll finish his quote. Good leadership can see issues before they become full-blown problems and step in to redirect, fix, or help. Then his last quote is interesting. Independence is not a virtue. So there you go. He's, I didn't say those things. Those were Tony's. So go after BMA if you didn't like that.
Yeah, just come on.
But you heard Alan's testimony. He came back from mission field in that conference, and he saw the drift. You know, conferences can both prevent drift and they can accelerate drift. It can work both ways. So again, the strength can also be the weakness. I know Keystone's wounded some people and I've talked with, you know, really, it comes back to the relationships and assessing how are we actually doing in our relationships. I've wounded people. I've talked to the people I've wounded, I think, most of them. But I've also talked to both sides of some of the painful situations that have happened in Keystone over the last couple of years, and it's fascinating just to hear the two different sides. Both their hearts are right. I mean, most of them. I don't think any of them are just evil, ill-intentioned people. And so, but I see sometimes how actually both sides needed what the other was bringing most of the time. And it's unfortunate that the explosions happen the way they do. I think really both sides, and most of the times when I've listened to the story, I've seen them not doing well with their own. They've thoroughly examined the failures of the other side and not done so well in examining, you know, how they contributed to it. So that's, I guess I kind of answered. What would I tweak? The last question, what would I tweak? Are we supposed to be answering that one?
Sure.
I would tweak probably moving us more toward actually a hybrid model of all three of the elements: the conference, the fellowship, and the congregational involvement. And some maybe extreme situations on the way far end of the spectrum may be totally congregational led and kind of resistant to any kind of authority. And I've talked to individuals I share with pretty closely that are in, you know, unaffiliated brotherhoods, that they've walked through stages and phases where they almost reacted to any kind of authority. And he said, you know, I'm not going to name who it was, but I respect him and then the congregation. He said, you know, we realized we were going places that weren't right. But, you know, there's still elements of that where I'd love to see Keystone develop a plan to strategically pull more of our men, to wake them up, to actually get their input, garner their input into church life, church leadership, church vision. So much sleeping potential sometimes, it seems. And I don't know, I wrestle with, is it because that's what they want, or is it because that's what's been easiest for us as leadership? And I think maybe sometimes it's both.
Could I just add, you might be sitting wondering why we are talking about this. In our congregation, we spent the last 8 years storming over this question of affiliation. And if you're working toward a church plan, if you can discuss it ahead of time, know where you're going, I think you can get through that storming quicker than after you're there. A couple other negative things. One of those is some of our young men wanted to go into CASP, and Keystone has CASP, Mid-Atlantic has CASP, Beachy has CASP. I don't know if BMA does or not, but we don't have, and the other groups said, well, no, we decided we're just doing our own group. And so that's not there. Also, a number of years ago, I'll really go historic here, but in 1985, we started a discussion with two other unaffiliated churches, said we're not comfortable with any of the mission opportunities for our young people that were around. And so we started looking at missions, and our three churches decided we were going to go in a scouting venture, and we were ready to go, and Keystone found out about it and said, well, could we send a person along as well? And the result of that was Olive Branch Mennonite Missions was formed in 1988. And so now we had that, and so we were part of that. Now the other two churches have joined a fellowship, and so we're the only one in there that's unaffiliated. The others are all Mid-Atlantic, are all Keystone, and then Midwest. So that's some of the negative things, but also it can be done otherwise as well. And the other thing is our young people might not have a the young people at the Alliance, I see them, they have their convention. And so, okay, here are the young people that we associate with in the Keystone, in the Mid-Atlantic, and the Beachy. They all have, the young people kind of are there. And our young people, especially with our church being far away from other congregations, don't have the interactions as much. We find our young people, our children, often driving an hour, hour and a half to be with other young people, youth groups, singing groups, whatever. And then sometimes those young people will come and visit our family, and they'll say, wow, it's really far out here. We're like, yeah, it's just as far the other direction.
I don't have anything to offer about the tweak thing. I do feel some concern about, and I'm not saying it's in your case, Larry, but unaffiliated groups where pastors are not accountable to somebody. And that worries me, because all of us need somebody that we're accountable to. We need people that we relate with on an ongoing basis to help polish off some of the sharp corners and to critique. No pastor has all of the gifts. And we all need to hear from others to help bring balance. So if you're going to be an unaffiliated group, I would suggest that you do work at cultivating regular relationships with some, so that you have that balancing factor to you. The other thing is, pastors sometimes, you get really lonely, and you can get really discouraged. There were times that I went to a conference, our conference session. I was so discouraged. I didn't want to talk to anybody. And some other pastor came and sat beside me and asked me, and I started crying. And he helped me walk through that. And if it wouldn't have been for that, I don't know if I would be in pastoral work today.
Jeremy, is there more from your notes that you wanted to share? If there's an item or two there that you really wanted to say, go ahead. While you're thinking, we'll take one of these mics here. We don't have any more in the back. Is that correct, Jason? So we'll take one of these here. If you have a question, please hold the mic up close enough that we can hear that, and then any of these brothers up here can respond to that as they like.
You mentioned how to handle church discipline. What do you do when people when they fall into sin and you want to go to address it and they just leave the church? Is that end of it, or what? How do you handle that?
And are you talking like clearly blatant unscriptural sin, or are you just talking more ambiguous or less clear, but you may have concerns with them, but nothing very open or forthright on the issues that?
It's very open, I guess. The situation I'm thinking of is there was fornication involved. His wife left him, and he claims he repented, but he's not willing to do what the church asked of him to try to make reconciliation with his wife.
I think looking at Matthew 18, we need to talk to him individually, which you've done, you said, and as a church, or a couple people talking to him. But I think as and maybe that's more for offenses, but looking at this I think it's important that we recognize that we as a kingdom are not putting people in prison like a civil authority would, but that they voluntarily came into the church and they can voluntarily leave. And I think we need to weep and pray when they choose that way and won't repent. But looking at them and recognizing that's where they are, and we have to leave it to God. He has to convict.
Yeah, the church is a voluntary association, and that was an Anabaptist perspective right from the very beginning. I tell people it's easier to get out of our church than it is to get into our church, so you don't have to worry about becoming a part of a cult. A cult's hard to get into, and then no, it's easy to get into, and it's hard to get out. So, in several cases, we had immorality and tried to work with the person, and there was denial. And then we called the person to a congregational meeting with the warning, if you don't show up, this is what could happen. And in both of those cases, they didn't show up. And so then the congregation voted to excommunicate them. In two other situations, it was not a case of immorality. It was like the guy wanting to wear studs in his ears or have long corn braids or whatever. And so there we met personally, and we tried to appeal to them, appeal with the scripture, give time to think about it, call them back, ask them, which do you value more? If you value your church membership, we're asking you for a change in your behavior. They refused to. In that case, we did not proceed to an excommunication because it did not seem to us to be at the same level, like immorality and swindling and drunkenness and so on. You could say, pull out the rebel card and say, well, you rebelled, and so what rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and so therefore we're going to excommunicate you in that way. But we chose not to, but rather than to present to the congregation that these brothers have chosen not to agree to what we as a church have agreed to, and so we are recommending that their membership be rescinded. And that's how that was handled. But still, you try to appeal, you try to pursue, but the church is not a prison, it's a voluntary association.
And like I said, by God's mercy, in the 3 years I've been in leadership, we haven't had to excommunicate anybody. I did spend about 10 years working at Fresh Start, and so that's some of Ernest and my earliest connections. You were there back in the day, weren't you, Randy? Yeah, okay, so a couple of us, yeah, mini Fresh Start reunion. Anyway, but I would just say, yeah, especially in cases of sexual sin, the input of those closest to them is very crucial, and especially the wife, the children, the church, and if they're not listening, I believe a physical analogy would be cancer. How would you treat the cancer? And just on that whole thing of sexual addiction recovery, please, 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 tears and testimonies may mean something to God, but you're not God and neither am I, and we don't know what they mean to God, because some of those individuals become experts at praying and crying and giving testimonies when they need to, and they can fool the best. I've seen a situation, an 80-year-old grandpa was some serious things, and I think there was some truth to it, had the congregation completely divided and could have split the congregation at the drop of the hat, and the ministers were just, they didn't know what to do. And so, but there again, it doesn't sound like you're dealing with that clever of a divide and conquer strategist. Some of them become experts at it, but again, please don't take the prayers, the tears, the testimonies from it has to be a long-term process and the fruit has to show long term. And there are individuals in your congregation with sensitivities probably beyond mine that are going to know. They're going to be able to sniff out whether this guy's for real or whether he's still playing games.
And like you said, Jeremy, it can fool the best of us. We had a case like that. And the judge said, gave a much lighter sentence because we were involved. And with the understanding that I would meet with him weekly for accountability. And little did I know, while we were meeting for accountability weekly, he had 2 other women on the side. And so that really shook my ability to discern, to understand. Yeah, if the sin has been a long-term sin issue and there's a pattern, then you should expect that it will be about at least that long to demonstrate the fruits of true repentance. Don't take it lightly.
Okay.
I want to thank you all for coming in. Questions. I guess I have 2 questions. First off, from being SBC, church discipline is all but non-existent. They just quit participating, and there's so many Southern Baptist churches, you get mad, you just go somewhere else. And so church discipline, I've never seen a church handle outside of what we had to do. My question for you is, let's say you go to a church setting where church discipline has either never been practiced or never been talked about, and how do you introduce the congregation that this is a biblical thing to do, that it's necessary, without sounding mean or sounding like, oh, you're just trying to shut people out? And the second question is this: how would you handle a church where discipline has been neglected and there's been an ongoing problem for a few decades, that the pastors and leaders in the past have chose just to leave instead of dealing with the issue, and it's gone on and on for those number of years? How would you walk a church through dealing with that level of discipline when there's not been stable leadership within the church?
Just to start off, and then Jeremy and Larry can add the finishing touches. Obviously, it has to start, Jonathan, with scriptural teaching. Let's go back to the Bible. What does the Bible say about it? You have Jesus teaching on it. You have Paul teaching about it. You have others talking about it. What does the Bible say? And of course, we want to be a biblical church, so let's take a serious look at it. There may be in the congregation people who have been wounded, and so they're going to be very skittish, very nervous about church discipline. You might check to see if the church covenant or bylaws says anything about it. That would be something to bring into the conversation as well. The second of your questions, I think, is the harder one, Jonathan. Now, in many of our churches, the pastors have not been brought in from the outside. They're raised up from within. My dad actually was called to pastor a church, and there was you might say, the old guard that became united, and my dad was not on the inner circle, so that was a really tough situation. And so in some cases, the pastor may have to go because he just can't continue there. Or if he's very resilient, he may go for the long haul and see who dies the soonest, and try to pray his way through it, or ask God for discipline, like with Ananias and Sapphira or something, but that's very hard. And do you spare the congregation of that and move on? Or do you slog your way through it? And that is for Jeremy and Larry to answer.
You know, it's fascinating to me. I mentioned I was part of a business peer group, and these issues aren't unique to churches. I think we face an extra element of spiritual warfare. So it's extra challenging for churches, but they're not unique to us. And I find there's a lot of principles that work in business because they've discovered them, they stumbled on them by accident, not through studying the Bible, but because God designed us as people, and there's similarities in how he designed us to relate. And so the things that work, they've just somehow discovered those principles without Scripture. Some of them with Scripture, some of them would be Christian writers. But those principles, what I'm getting at is there's functionality is true in business, but it's also true in church life, functional leadership. And so my question would be, I'd want to do a very thorough assessment of everyone, in my own mind at least. I would suggest, would they be willing? One idea would be, would they be willing to bring in outside input? I think that's wise for any organization, and even a church, especially if it's a church that's struggling. And that there again is where a conference or fellowship can be a bit of an advantage. Of course, the bad part about it is the conference can send in bishops to reinforce dysfunctional leadership, which happens far too many times. But in that, if you can do some outside assessment to help assess where the actual problems are, do your own assessment internally of your own contribution, so it's more than just the sin issue. What actually is the sin issue the actual issue that you need to deal with, or is it resultive? There's obviously almost as big as the sin issue that hasn't been dealt with is the sin issue that hasn't been dealt with. The sin issue of fear of man. Proverbs tells us a fear of man brings a snare. And they're obviously, I'm assuming it's a significant sin issue that isn't being dealt with, and that there's pretty much common knowledge of it. And Paul, you see in Corinthians there how Paul dealt with that. It's reported commonly that, I think Paul sets a bit of an example for us in courage and how to deal with dysfunction, but it's not okay. And so I don't know that you have to go at it you don't have to write a letter to the church necessarily. You can pick more strategic ways to go about it. But I definitely would say, for me, it wouldn't be an option to continue in that capacity without moving forward, without taking action. That said, our Anabaptist circles have plenty of our own messes, and I'm very burdened. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we have got to deal with our own dysfunctions if we're going to really be effective inviting people in.
Jonathan, I just read a book this year called Antagonists in the Church. I forget the author's name, but it's very helpful. And he gives some profiles of people who are chronic antagonists, who stir up stuff. There are different kinds of antagonists, so that was a really helpful read. And it's a little bit comforting to know that in the midst of all of this, we are really more New Testament than what we thought as churches, because John wrote Diotrephes. He loves to have the first place, and he even tells people not to receive missionaries. And he speaks evil against me, and when I come, I'm going to deal with him. So we're New Testament churches, aren't we? We've got it just like they did.
I think we need to carry out discipline, and I think somebody else should do it because I'm too merciful. The thing that I struggle with sometimes is in walking with people and talking to them, trying to look at situations and things in their lives that often they just leave, and some have said, well, shouldn't they be excommunicated instead of just leaving? And that's still a question that I don't know what the right answer is.
Okay. Well, a couple of brothers here asked questions about church discipline, so if you have any of the rest of you back here have some word of advice for them, you can go to them here in our next session while the ladies are in meeting here, and you can share with them whatever you'd like. I'd like to open up just for a few more questions, maybe on a different topic other than church discipline. So if there's something you'd like to ask these brothers, maybe you're trying to establish a leadership team or think about how you're going to affiliate with other churches, and if you want some advice from them, go right for it. So go ahead back here.
I have a question about the relationship between parachurch ministries and local congregations within the setting of conference or the BMA model or the unaffiliated model. What works? What are some potential pitfalls? What doesn't work? A lot of church plants, you know, people are starting coffee shop ministries with the idea of it being a church plant. Well, and yet the coffee shop isn't exactly a church. So how do these non-church ministries relate well with actual congregations?
I think it's important for parachurch ministries to define what they're doing. When I was on Olive Branch board, we were kind of getting pulled in a couple of directions, and we needed to sit down and say, what are we? And we decided we were a church planting mission and not supporting already churches there. And so that gave us definitive in it. But as far as supporting, I think we as a congregation unaffiliated can look at things and decide, well, you know, we really aren't quite where they're going, and so not supporting that one and changing to a different place. I'm not sure if I'm fully answering your question. I'll see what the others say.
I think it's good as a leader, Norm, of a parachurch organization to be in communication with the leaders of churches from which you would like to have support, either by money or by personnel. I heard of one situation of an unaffiliated ministry that went into an area and, unbeknown to the pastors, met with several of their members to recruit them for a ministry. And then later that came out, and it didn't generate a lot of fuzzies, right? So in any ministry, whether it's sponsored by a coalition of churches or whether it's unaffiliated, we need all the support that we can get, all the goodwill and understanding that we can get, and that's called building relationships and not working behind other people's backs.
Yeah, I didn't know if Ernest or some of the guys from State College got you to field that question or not. I'm kidding. The coffee shop there. But no, I don't really have a whole lot more to add. I think it's crucial that respect is genuine on both sides, because it's going to be felt if it's absent, and so you respect and want to work with, extend that, and I have, by the way. I think I've felt that from the brothers there at State College and in some of their outreach. So yeah, just open communication, clarity, and even asking advice. You know, if you're looking to, or your question was how do we generate involvement? I'm not sure I was quite understanding what you were shooting for there, Norm.
I think, well, the real issue is that at Northern Youth we have a staff church, and it is unaffiliated, and we are a ministry program, and sometimes we're more of a ministry program and less of a church, and sometimes we wonder why we're not more of a church and less of a ministry program, or which how should the spiritual needs of staff be met in a parachurch organization? I think that's maybe more clearly what the question is.
Okay, that helps me understand.
So there in State College, we have a set of expectations for people who come to work there and live in our area. And They're expected to be a part of our church, submit to our church, et cetera, while they're there, if they're living in our area. And they know that from the very beginning, that that's the expectation. So that has been helpful and cleared up some things we didn't have at the beginning. And we can hand this paper to people and say, here's our expectations for those of you who are only planning to be here for 6 months or a year or 2 years. I don't know if this particularly answers your question, but I've worked for a lot of nonprofits, some under churches and some by independent boards. And recently I was talking to the board chairman of an organization we're starting there in State College, and he was saying how that some ministry parachurch leaders want to be under a church and some do not. Some feel like the church interferes. And if the ministry leaders feel like the church is interfering, then it's probably not a good structure. If the ministry leaders welcome the church being involved, it's probably more healthy. So I thought that was a good rubric for thinking about it.
And just from a conference church leader's perspective, it conversely is probably true as well. If we as church leaders are saying, man, this is a terrible organization because they're parachurch, that probably maybe is the reason why they're a little concerned about being under that type of leadership. You know, it can work both ways. It has.